Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Labor's End, how the promise of automation degraded work. My name is Heather, and I'm the publicity manager at the University of Illinois Press, and I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Resnikoff and Dr. Lichtenstein for being here today. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a 15-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code LE40 to get a 40% discount on the book on the University of Illinois Press website. I'll put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Jason Resnikoff is a core lecturer in the history department at Columbia University. He specializes in labor history, the history of global capitalism, intellectual history, and the history of technology. His book, Labor's End, explores the ideological origins of automation in the US in the middle of the 20th century. You can find his work in Labor, International Labor and Working Class History, Tropics of Meta, Zocalo Public Square, Western Humanities Review, Paris Review Daily, and the Encyclopedia of American Recessions and Depressions. He is affiliated with Columbia University's American Studies Department, where he advises undergraduate senior theses, as well as Columbia's Justice and Education Initiative, through which he teaches incarcerated students. His time working as an organizer for the United Auto Workers grounds his scholarship. His current research interests include the intersection of racism and technology. Nelson Lichtenstein is research professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. A historian of labor and political economy, he is the author or editor of 16 books, including a biography of the labor leader Walter Reuther and State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. With Gary Gersel and Alice O'Connor, he edited Beyond the New Deal Order, From the Great Depression to the Great Recession. And with Roman Huret and Jean Christian Vanel, he edited a companion volume, Capitalism Contested, The New Deal and Its Legacies. Other publications include The Right and Labor in America, Politics, Ideology and Imagination, edited with Elizabeth Shermer, and The Retail Revolution, How Walmart Created a Brave New World of Business. Lichtenstein is currently writing a history of economic thought and policy making in the administration of Bill Clinton. He writes for Dissent, Jacobin, New Labor Forum, and American Prospect. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. You can all hear me, right? Okay, good. Well, I'm delighted to be here with Jason and this wonderful book that he wrote. I hope will be widely adopted. So let me start off with this. Tell us automation. Sometimes I think of hula hoops when I think of automation. It sort of does have a mid-50s kind of mid-century. Tell us when does it begin? When does this great craze about automation begin, and when does it sort of end, if it has ended at all? What's the kind of that's the chronology here? I guess we're historians, so chronology is important, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the major argument of the book, right, is that automation is not a specific technology or a process, but it's in fact an ideological framing of just changes to the means of production, of technological change. And we can get into this later, but the actual substance of what was called automation bears no striking difference to earlier changes to industrial technology since the middle of the 19th century. So the actual word is coined in the immediate post-war period by the Ford Motor Company, of all places. It's some VP of production coins in D.S. Harder. And the Ford Automation Department opens around 1947. And so the question is why is the Ford Motor Company, coming up with this word? And the answer, of course, is a couple of things. I mean, first of all, the major innovation in the 1930s and the 1940s in at least automobile manufacturing wasn't any specific piece of technology. Rather, it was the industrial labor movement, right? That's the main thing that management's reacting to in the 1940s, and mainly the strength of workers on the job. So immediately, right, D.S. Harder in 1947, they're putting new machines of different kinds into mainly the Rouge facility, but throughout their entire industrial plant. And one of the machines that they've been using for some time, but they do a heavier investment in, is something called the transfer machine. And the transfer machine was like a machine tool that was on a conveyor belt, and it could do some things automatically that beforehand you would have needed a worker to do, a skilled worker, mainly like punching metal and finally boring holes in engine blocks. And engine blocks are very heavy, so these machines could turn them and bore a hole in them. But these transfer machines had existed since the 1880s, and automobile companies have been using them since at least the 1920s. Rather, so D.S. Harder says, we have a bunch of these transfer machines lined up. It's called a transfer line now. And what this shows us is that soon workers will no longer be needed, in American manufacturing, which is a huge claim that has really no bearing on the immediate technology, right? The machines displaced some workers, others were fired, but allowed them to hire more. It generally sped up work in the factory. So, but nevertheless, Ford is using this word to try to make an argument about why they actually might not need workers in the future. And so the main innovation here is not technological, but rather ideological. So the Ford Motor Company is arguing that technological process will one day mean semi-skilled and even skilled workers won't be necessary anymore. And this is really a tactic for the bargaining table as a way of arguing that when the Ford Motor Company is making changes to the layout of a factory, that they aren't doing this to gain control over the factory or to get more work out of workers. Rather, this is apolitical technological progress, I should say, just evolving naturally on its own. Which is a very effective method in the 1940s.
These guys burst on the scene. I know the famous, I think you have it, the famous Cleveland engine block factory where Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, takes a tour, and the Ford guy who's chugging around says, look at all these machines, Walter. They don't pay union dues, and Reuther says they don't buy Ford cars either. So that's part of that, encapsulates that ideological political bargaining contestation there, right?
Yeah, and it also points to, I think one of the things that made it so nerve-wracking at the time too, right? Because post-depression, the idea is what's going to be economic good governance is like mass purchasing power. And of course, and so it made it very hard for employers to say, we're going to lay off a bunch of people, we're going to speed up work, because then they'd be bad economic citizens in the post-war period. But when you can summon automation, it's like, it's not management that's deciding we're going to fire workers and challenge this Keynesian hegemony. It's technology itself, and that and management has nothing to do with that. We're just simply keeping up with progress. It's one of the reasons it was so handy for them, for sure.
I don't think you mentioned the A-bomb in your, well, maybe in your book, but I mean, this is this moment of enormous prestige for science, right, and technology, right? I mean, probably the apogee of it in the last century, right? Right after the war. Do you think that sort of technological determinism, you think that's an element here that encompasses everything?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's what makes it persuasive in the period. And also, I mean, I imagine we'll end up talking about this, but I think it's what, in a way, intellectually disarms so much of the labor movement and labor movement leadership in particular. And the thing is, it's kind of hard to put oneself back into, at least I find it difficult to kind of go put one's mind back in that period, just how many major technological changes had happened in a short period of time, right? So even all right, the interwar period can be called, Siegfried Gideon called it the period of, full mechanization, but it seemed like the culmination of the industrial apparatus had been reached. And then one after another, there are all these very impressive changes that still shape our world today, right? Jet planes, the atomic bomb, the electronic digital computer, antibiotics become widely available. It seems that humanity is on the verge of conquering the natural world. I think it's also when you get some of this breathlessness that's so easy to make fun of with 1950s kitsch, tomorrow on the moon or something like that, right? But in fact, it was persuasive, and it was a credible argument to make, especially, I mean, the A-bomb is actually the perfect example, because it seemed at least that it was this major scientific breakthrough that won a political contest, right? That won the second war.
Yeah. But, okay, before we get to I want to talk about so various intellectuals, the left and right, who were into automation. But before we get to that, tell the viewership here one of your major themes, which is that automation leads to speed up, to actually intensification. Give us some examples, or just explain that a little more. That automation, rather than being labor saving, is actually creates labor, more intensification, both wherever, auto plants or kitchens or wherever you want,
Yeah. I mean, it's the hallmark throughout, and I would say it's still, when people talk about automation in the present, it's certainly the case. I'll talk about it in the post-war period, stick with the book for a bit perhaps, but then we can talk about modern day examples, I suppose. But I mean, one of the key examples that I think of is actually and maybe this will be the most exciting for people who are listening or watching, would be in the adoption of the electronic digital computer in the post-war period. That's a good example because, you know, in the post-war period, there's a boom in clerical labor as American business and like the multinational corporation begins to come into its own, has a lot more paperwork. And computer manufacturers begin to sell companies on the idea that a computer, I mean, they actually do sell the digital computer on the promise of automation. That's specifically what it's going to do. And they'll be able to cut their payroll down because they'll need fewer clerical workers. But in fact, throughout the post-war period, like really from 1945 into the mid-1980s, the number of clerical workers in the United States grows and continues to grow. Like, I think something like 1 in 4 women who were working in the workforce in like 1955 were actual clerical workers. It was a huge number. Mm-hmm. And so industry says, you know, the computer industry says to, you know, these big American offices, this will do the job of typing and data entry, this thing called the electronic digital computer. But in fact, what it does is it just speeds up the work. What happens is the computer can, in fact, process certain kinds of information, but data entry remained the task of the human hand. And so this is exactly how automation works, if it does anything at all, because all kinds of machines are called automation. Sometimes they literally just make a person go faster. But even when they do take on a task and create and increase the amount of power, like let's say literal processing power in an office, still in order for that to actually pay a profit, for that to be valuable, other aspects of the labor process now need to speed up to match that speed. This is often what happened. That's exactly what happened with the digital computer. So you have all these offices all of a sudden finding that they have to hire more workers than before in order to make the computer useful because it crunches numbers so quickly. They need a lot of people to enter data. I mean, that's one example where, you know, there was a lot of talk in the 50s and the 60s about how automation is going to, you know, empty the office. But in fact, automation meant more workers rather than fewer. In other cases, like the automobile industry is a good example, with something like the transfer machine. Indeed, a lot of workers were fired from the engine lines in a few plants, like Cleveland, Buffalo. These are the main ones that, at least for Ford Motor Company. But on the other hand, workers complain that now with a new increased speed, they have to work faster, and they end up saying, I'm doing the job of 1 or 2 or even 3 people. And it was, I mean, it was the same across the board. It was the same with the continuous miner in coal mining. Yeah. Well, in freight, when the shift from coal to diesel, that, you know, these freight operators began getting rid of like the coal shovelers, and instead they take one job and, you know, or they would take 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and then they would condense it, and the workers who were left over would now need to take on the tasks of someone who had been fired. And so that was also absolutely typical. Yeah, and by the way, from my work at Walmart, I mean the rise of the scanner, the barcode. So that was designed. The idea of that was twofold. One, if we have a barcode, we can put more products in a store, but also we can use barcodes to eliminate all these checkout these women clerks who were unionizing, and this was in the 60s and 70s. Well, it turned out they got the barcode and everything. It turned out the number of clerks expanded, you know, but it did mean you had the big mega stores, the big box stores with like 100,000 or 200,000 different items could not have been, you know, you needed the barcode to do that. You just quadrupled the size of these stores, and then you also, anyway, and also of course it also, like you mentioned the phrase surveillance capitalism in your book. Also, of course, when you have a barcode and you have a scanner, then you can count and check, you know, the productivity of that individual, you know, and that's true for many other things, you know. Imagine we'll end up talking about Amazon at some point, but I mean, a lot of what's called automation, it's really weird. They're usually mainly surveillance technologies. Actually, I'm very impressed with them. I don't know, the example I sometimes use of contemporary examples of automation, and it's very trivial, but that's why I kind of like to use it, I think, which is like the automatic checkout counter. That's a great example of, like, from the company's books, no one is doing this job, but it's absolutely still human labor. It's not just the consumer does it, right? Yeah, well, that's transferring to the consumer. Let me ask another question here. Leisure, you have a discussion of leisure. Okay, what's wrong? I like leisure, but what's wrong with leisure? Escaping from work. What's wrong with that? I'm for that. I'm procrastinating and all that, so etc. So you have a whole discourse. You have a discussion of that, and so what's wrong with that? What's wrong with leisure? Yeah, right. I mean, in theory, nothing is wrong with leisure. Well, I think it's when leisure. I mean, all right, so this is the basic argument of the book, which is that with the rise of the automation discourse, something that it represented was a new definition of what political freedom would look like in the United States. I shouldn't say brand new, but knew that it would be hegemonic in at least in American political discourse. Yeah. And that difference is that the idea that if you have to work, that a working person cannot be free, that work itself is the cause of oppression, the need to meet any necessity at all. And up until, I would say, the middle of the 20th century, that the general idea, at least in like liberal American discourse, American liberalism, was that free people work for themselves. That's independence, right? What it means to be free is no one's giving you orders. It doesn't mean that the literal embodied condition of needing to survive in a natural world or a built environment is the thing that keeps you from being yourself. So that's, the American dream is being your own boss, be a small business owner. It's not being a gentleman, up on Parnassus, listening to lutes and thinking deep thoughts. Not necessarily. I mean, the only people who had really committed themselves to that definition of freedom in principle was, the slave power of the antebellum era. These are gentlemen who should not work, wouldn't dirty their hands. And so something that's so interesting is in the post-war period, I mean, not across the board, but you do see a rise in the definition of freedom as specifically leisure, that only leisured people are truly human, first of all, and they're the only ones who can actually really take part in politics. And it ends up having a lot of problems. Not that people shouldn't have free time, right? So if you look at something like, I hardly need to tell you, but the labor movement from at least the late last quarter of the 19th century, you had a very vibrant, since the middle of the 19th century, a very vibrant shorter hours movement. But the argument there wasn't, that the mere necessity of having to do any work at all is awful and everyone should leave the factory entirely, although many would have liked to have done that, but rather it's 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure, 8 hours free time, and then 8 hours rest. And the idea being that workers need to control their work, and that would mean limiting it in time, but not abolishing it completely, right? And so that's the major difference. So the problem with leisure is that it implies a denigration of work. And it tells you that the only way you can be yourself is by escaping work, and that work is a non-political activity, basically. Like it's just the oppression of nature, and that's what kind of becomes not the only definition of freedom in the middle of the 20th century, but remarkably popular across the political spectrum.
I think one of the major things in your book is the way in which areas of human activity are being transformed into biological, i.e. non-political, necessity, and therefore are off the table as a kind of, subject of debate or discourse. And so I think that we'll get to that sort of the left. I want to ask a question about that later on. Why the left was so enamored by this, and good trade union leaders as well. But one thing I was reading your book, and all of a sudden there's several paragraphs on Aristotle. I said, what? What's going on here? So, in this book, this book about transfer machines and the Ford Motor Company, we get Aristotle. So tell me, where does Aristotle enter your book? I think that was. And by the way, for the people viewing it, the book is a broad a kind of conceptualization of many things. It's more than just a discussion of what's going on in some assembly line in 1953. So go on, tell me about Aristotle here.
Yeah, Aristotle. Again, it really is in the record. Like I didn't impose it. Although, look, there are a few of my students who are on this thing right now, and they'll be like, "Oh my God, this guy talks about Aristotle incessantly." We have to read about it in the book. But I was quite surprised to find out how much Aristotle just comes roaring back into the record in the post-war period, and that's because he's the philosopher of gentlemen, and he's an excellent philosopher who, he was, of course, he's the tutor of the West, and he's maybe he's the great, I think, philosopher of free time, of leisure, and also, probably the most nuanced defender of a sort of stable, static hierarchy. And so I think what ends up happening is that with this sense, right, that and really this is like a hallmark of industrialization already, for decades before the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, was this sense that there was something essentially alienating about work under industrial conditions, that it could not be made coherent with a humane existence. And that had been in tension with like the industrial labor movement. It's like, no, perhaps if people own their jobs or if it's limited in time and space, it could be a good job, even though you're working, in the detailed division of labor in a very loud factory that would seem to not have much to offer the human person. But with the promise of automation, it would seem, even though it was a false promise, to use Stanley Aronowitz's words, even when you have this false promise that all of a sudden maybe everyone could leave the factory, that offered a kind of solution to what had been a tension in industrial society. Maybe it's okay that workers alienating. In fact, we should perfect our alienation from it if really we're going to have a race of natural slaves, which is
robots as slaves, right? But if you are in favor of slaves and robots, well, maybe they aren't all robots, but yeah, it's a
exactly.
I mean, and you reference Greek society, where the Greek idea, yes, it's a slave society, and that's good because that means a cultured minority can be, civilization, but that's based on a world of slavery. I mean, Calhoun said that as well, and in the antebellum South, but the Greeks, and so that that's sort of that we're going to have a bunch of robots in the factory here, and then we can have civilization. Yeah, go ahead.
And of course, there's all on the political left, especially, Marx himself was quite enamored of Aristotle. He name checks Aristotle in Capital, for Pete's sake, right? It would seem to be, wouldn't that be an ideal utopian society where everyone is a gentleman? And it's one vision of what it might look like. And look, if you could produce a society where, mechanism automatically produced everything we possibly needed, I suppose. But in reality, that just never happens. And once you kind of buy into that vision of freedom, you end up really, denigrating a lot of tasks that don't in and of themselves necessarily need to be integrated.
Right. What about everybody else who's still, they're selling papers on the corner or whatever they're doing? Well, they're unfree. Then. I do remember the one humorous thing that trade union leaders in the 50s or 60s were saying, okay, look, we're gonna have all this leisure here. So how are we gonna get our workers, rather than watching TV or something, so roller derby or something, how are we gonna get them to go to symphonies and stuff like that?
And what's so crazy is like that totally flips in the 1970s, right? In the 1950s and the 1960s, where no one is sophisticated enough. It's middle brow culture is the worst thing that ever happened. People are reading Alexis de Tocqueville and going like, yes, he was right about democracy, it's insipid and mediocre. But then, in the 1970s, you have people complaining, oh, the workers are too smart. They all went to college. They're rebellious. They don't know how to take jobs like their parents did. Capital turns on a dime when it becomes convenient. And now it's we have too many college-educated people for our dumb jobs.
Okay, well, one of the big things, the most surprising things in your book, and kind of something that needs to be really dealt with, I think, by others, everybody, is why the left, the black left, the trade union left, the lots of people. there are some exceptions, and we'll get to them. I want to ask you about them, but the left basically buys into this in a big way, and I wrote a book about Walter Reuther, and he. In many ways, he's clearly a liberal, but he is also certainly buys into the idea that there is this automation revolution coming, and he wants what to do about it. So why is the left in this? Is it just peculiar to this moment, or is this a problem with the left? In kind of what a mega historical sense.
Look, and indeed, and it kind of still is a problem with the left. It's become less so, but you do have like the accelerationist vision of what society is. And it's like a certain read of Marxism, I suppose, which is that, the end of history was going to be communism, and that's going to be ushered in by the mode of production. And so we just have to get the mode of production to its place where it will become sort of like a second nature, and it will just provide for everyone in a kind of Edenic setting. And, the lion will lay down with the lamb and everything will be great. And so I think the left was already sort of predisposed to that. And in fact, technological utopianism comes out of the left, I think it's fair to say, as a movement. Usually, what will become the conservative wing, the right wing, is not so enamored with it. In fact, a big part of the right is very hostile to the idea of industrialization. There's some left critics from the 19th century who are hostile to industrialization, but they're actually few and far between, right? Because it's going to be progress itself. And so I think that there was a predisposition to see it that way, and to see progress in history as necessarily being liberatory and kind of left-leaning. And then also, I think what's notable about the post-war period, and again, it's really hard to emphasize this, and it's a question in and of itself that requires its own investigation, I suppose, was that technological optimism was really rife in the post-war period. It was incredibly persuasive. And if folks, I suppose if you want to know how that could be, if you look at today, and people, when they invoke AI or something, it's, it's not clear what it is, but it seems decisive and big promises are made about what will it do. But imagine that, but much more so for the entire industrial apparatus. It seems it's going to enter into this new age. So that's, so for the left, I think it also solves a critical problem that the right doesn't have quite as much. And for the left, it's how do you reconcile freedom and the necessity to work? And on the right, that's never a problem because they're not working. They hire people, they're capital. They don't need to reconcile these two. In fact, it's really great, if only free people are the ones who don't work. And it's totally coherent. And so for the left, when you're, well, we still have to go to the job, but we don't seem to be free on the job, it's such a relief. And which is not to say that the left wing in the post-war period was intellectually bankrupt or wasn't savvy. I mean, they saw a lot of important things in it. But I do think it's this sense of like, whatever the future is, it's vague and it's very hard to say. And so with labor leaders, it's especially tricky for them. And like Walter Reuther above all, because Walter Reuther, he's trying to turn, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong with this, obviously I'm talking to the guy who wrote the book on it, but trying to turn wage workers into salaried workers. He's trying to have them get job guarantees. He's trying to procure all the things for workers that a welfare state should provide to citizens and to get it provided through the company. Yeah. So in the immediate, of course, unions are fighting to try to control job classifications and good, in good hours. But at the same time, there's this vision that maybe we can just graduate all these guys, men and women, but definitely guys, into the middle class.
Right. So, yeah.
And so like, if the technology is going to go that way, all right, maybe we should talk about job training or something like that. Right. And so it satisfied an ideal that they had. And I think in that way, it was very seductive.
I mean, by the way, what you're saying is the whole war on poverty, which was basically, we won't use the government to actually create jobs. We'll just train people. And I think that what your book fits into that, and it's sort of the ideological presupposition of that war on poverty and why that training was so much money. But let me ask you about a figure who's not a trade union leader, but today a kind of becoming increasingly actually prominent. I mean, James Boggs, who was an African-American militant, et cetera. Very. His work has been reprinted, and he's considered one of the early, I don't know what, a lot of founders of the civil rights movement, but a working class civil rights figure from Detroit. Tell me about him and his view of this.
I got to spend a lot of time in James. I got to spend a lot of time in James Boggs' papers in Detroit, and he's a very inspiring figure, and also I think maybe one of the most inspired American Marxists or most inspired interpreters of Marx, because basically the Black Panthers end up taking a lot of his argument about the relationship between class and race, and they make it part of their platform. But I mean, for him, of course, he's part of the Marxist humanist movement. Based in Detroit, he worked for Chrysler for 20 years. Yes. And he also has this, I think one of the things that's exciting about him is he does this basically impossible thing, which is a quote unquote organic intellectual. He's a working class, who's also, in correspondence with Bertrand Russell. It almost never happens. It's fascinating, right? And he's a fascinating figure. And then, of course, his partner is Grace Lee Boggs. And I think she has a PhD from Bryn Mawr, but she's also one of the first English translators of Marx's economic.
He's a very interesting figure, and he's in the Trotskyist or the unorthodox Trotskyist movement. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so he's also a very active organizer, and when he's a member of this, the sort of news and letters group, CLR James and Raya Dunevskaya, the Johnson Forest tendency, he's a member of this group, and he has a big break with them with his main book, right, The American Revolution, which I think comes out in '63. And there the argument is, and this is what I think the Panthers pick up on, which is that Black Americans and white Americans are split in the working class, right? The working class is split against itself. And so asking the working class to actually bring about the revolution is asking it too much of it. It's not the vanguard in the United States of America because basically of colonialism, internal colonialism. And that one part of the working class, the part that actually has the most access to the means of production, has basically been bought off because there's a super exploited portion of the working class, Black Americans, who are the ones who are taking the brunt of capital. capital exploitation in particular. So you won't get the labor movement basically bringing about a better world. Instead, you're going to look to Black Americans to do this. They're going to be the lever of history. And it's not because they have access to the means of production, and this is where automation comes in. It's because they're alienated perfectly from the means of production. It's because they aren't working as much. They've been systematically pushed out of the labor market. And so this is the revolutionary quotient of society. And of course, he's writing this just, I mean, as the civil rights movement is taking off. And indeed, you know, there's no question that the long civil rights movement does seem to be, especially in the post-war period, the most active part of progressive society. That's really the engine that's bringing about so much change. And so his description seems to make a lot of sense from a Marxist viewpoint, for sure. I mean, but the thing that was so kind of frustrating about it, reading it, was like, but it's not happening. But automation isn't actually happening, you know, but he thinks it is. And really what he's seeing is he's seeing speed up, he's seeing job degradation, and to a certain extent, he's seeing it on the job, but he's also, it's because it fits in so neatly with like a Marxian framework. And so I think he's a bit of a cautionary tale, but it shows that you can still produce amazing work, you know, with this idea in mind, but also shows its function, right? It would seem to like tell you that you can leave the workplace. You don't have to organize in the workplace anymore. We're going to organize outside.
I think that idea, I mean, that became very prominent in the left for a whole generation. That whether you're talking about the prison movement or the kind of the underclass, so that's a bad word, but you know, the kind of the alienated out of society, the whole third worldish kind of, you know, which is became very prominent in the 70s and 80s. I was going to say in that moment. Now, a figure like C. Wright Mills, which ostensibly would agree with Boggs on a lot of things. That is, Mills denounces the labor metaphysic. You know, he has saying, you know, the labor at the point of production, this is not where the radical, you know, activity can take place. So ostensibly, Mills would have agreed with that. But you make in your book, you have Mills as a critic of one of the few on the left critic of the automation discourse. So why was that? Why was he that?
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure. I think mainly that's because even though he does, you know, he's very critical of the old guard, and he becomes, you know, his letter to the new left is, it would seem to be, I mean, you know, the Port Huron statement does make a gesture towards work being very important, but then SDS moves away from it. So it's a bit murky there. But I think what made C. Wright Mills so alive to this issue was that he actually writes this in White Collar, which is like, you know, the history of the meaning of work has not yet been written. Basically, he's like summoning Herbert Gutman, you know, into being. He's waiting for Herbert Gutman to arrive. But which is, I think, at the very least, his understanding of politics was very rich and not narrow, and because it was had such wide breadth, even if, you know, the old labor movement isn't going to bring about the revolution, as I think is what he believed, nevertheless, that didn't mean that work was not a political activity. And so he was despairing that increasingly it seemed that workers were not participating in politics anymore, and that the idea of being able to negotiate over like the conditions of work, and again, its political meaning, had been sort of surrendered by the left. That deeply troubled him. And that's why he talks about cheerful robots, right? That's in the sociological imagination. He thinks that there's something wrong about that. And I think that basic sense is what clued him in to not accept, you know, entirely this idea of the automation discourses like as given. And I mean, and again, I mean, the other critic who's writing almost at the same time in a very similar vein is Hannah Arendt, for the same reason. But for her, right, it's not because she has so much commitment to the labor movement exactly, but it's because she's thinking of what we would call biopolitics today, right? She's thinking about the Holocaust and what happens like take when you biologize a giant of your political life, you end up opening the
I mean, the Nazi, you know, superfluous people, whether they were mentally ill or whatever. I mean, that was their biological, you know, conceptions of, you know, politics. I mean, I do. By the way, I do think there's a sense that politics can take place at work. I mean, by the way, Chrysler, where Boggs was, of all the auto companies, Chrysler had the strongest and historically the most kind of militant shop steward system. I mean, there was politics at Chrysler and at the workplace, and then but you know, people were projecting so much into the future. This automation gave you this sort of utopian kind of sense of what was going on, or dystopian, whatever it was, into the future. By the way, you have a wonderful phrase in your book. At the end, you say, "We don't take utopia seriously anymore," and I thought that's a great line. We've lost the capacity to do it. I mean, and so one thing, even about these what's the term? These sort of the people of the 50s and 60s, whatever they were, left, or you know, trade union leaders, or whoever they were taking utopia seriously. You know what? You know, or whether you know, they at least they were projecting. It was said of Walter Reuther, he could reminisce about the future. I mean, he, you know, there was that sort of. Whereas today, I don't know what. I mean, I don't. You know, it is a kind of much more darker world that you know, we live in, and in terms of who's utopian. I mean, you know, that one would buy into. There's a lot of dystopian futures, but no. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the best that, you know, the most serious utopians that we can get. I mean, there are plenty, but it's like, well, something like the Green New Deal, right? Which is actually a throwback, right? And maybe that's just because neoliberalism has done its work so very well. The very idea of a collective deliberate action has basically become a controversial issue, right? So
speaking of the end of this certain kind of automation utopia. So what happens in the 70s? Where does Lordstown, and you mentioned that, and the report, what's it called, the Work in America that is put out? How does that figure in the kind of what's the term? The fading of this automation, you know, idea? Yeah.
And indeed, you know, the automation discourse never goes away, but it definitely loses much of its rhetorical power in the 1970s. And basically, it has to do with you could call it the unraveling of the New Deal order, but also as the nation, the United States in particular, but industrial society more general, begins to hit some hard limits, right? It begins, like, the big promises of technological utopianism begin to not answer as well. So I would say the main issue, the main thing that brings into question the automation discourse, or the automation utopia, is just the resurgence of the labor movement in the 1970s. Well, resurgence is not quite the right word.
Maybe I
should say like the radical the left wing of the labor movement, or I just say the left wing in general. But you know, you have just the sort of the internal challenges, that's a better way of putting it, to the labor movement coming from the left, right? Whether it's the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, you have in the auto industry, or, you know, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, or, you know, the mine workers beginning to actually try to change their leadership.
And Lordstown, which was a GM factory, just to tell by my students, a General Motors factory, which was kind of highly, quote, automated. At least that was and there's a kind of actually it's a regular strike, but it's they're generally young workers, and they you know, go on strike in 1971 or something. Yeah.
Right. So like with Lordstown in particular, right, the strike in 1972, that was an example of what in an earlier era would have just been accepted as an automated factory, because, you know, GM is trying to recoup its losses as it's coming into conflict with, or I should say competition with Japanese and German car makers. They need to make a nice little car, supposedly, to buy, you know, get the Americans to buy their cars. But they, you know, and they introduce certain kinds of technological innovations, some of which are more impressive than others, like the Unimate. It's a little robot, a robotic arm that would look very familiar to people today, that did some spot welding, and then different kinds of computer systems that were meant to do logistics and to see where people were working and when. But in reality, it was a huge speed up. And so that's GM sent, you know, kind of folded in Lordstown to what was called GMAT, or, you know, General Motors Assembly Division. And this was like a special unit that was basically meant to get workers to work much harder. And it was actually GM factories across the country went on strike. It wasn't just Lordstown. You also had Norwood, which is just on the road. But it was particularly useful for for narrative purposes, I should say, the Lordstown strike, because it would have seemed to have been like the ideal American factory in a certain way, right? The workers are young, so they represent like the youth movement. There's kind of hippies, right? It's integrated. Black and white workers are working next to each other. Their wages are relatively high for the auto sector. They're unionized, and yet there's this very long strike, and it's a very vocal strike, very a public one, about how a job at GM feels like a prison sentence. You know, Is this all I can expect out of my life? And what's more, I think what made it so useful is it wasn't just workers striking for more pay, but they were actually striking over what will come to be known as quality of life issues. They weren't free at work. That was basically the gist. Yeah. And so this sense that I think one of the reasons it drew so much attention was because like all the promises of Fordism, all the promises of the post-war era were being fulfilled and it was being rejected. It wasn't good enough. And what's so ironic today is like today people would jump for a job like that, supposedly. These are like jobs that we've lost, but you know, at this height.
You know, right. So there's a moment when Ed Sidlowski runs for the presidency of the steelworkers, I think in the late 70s. And one of his arguments is, you know, the steelwork, it's sort of both a combination of what you're talking. He says steelworker jobs are really tough and miserable. So actually, I would like to, technological progress. I'd like to have it, but at the same time, you know, he is a left winger, and he wants, you know, kind of workers' control. This comes just at the moment, just before the collapse of the steel industry, and he's attacked by the regular unionists or by the more conservatives as what we just want any kind of job. You know, we don't try to make it better, just any kind of job. Don't even talk about that. And so I mean, and so by the way, in most of those unions, the left, which had been, you know, pushing on the basis of, you know, workers' control or human rights, its legs are cut out from under it in that industrialization period.
Exactly. I mean, and at least for the purposes of automation, the reason that this was important was it's just, you know, a public reminder of something that had been true all along, that people are still working very hard.
Let me ask you one more thing, which is not in your book, but something I cut my teeth on when I becoming kind of activist and things. By the late 70s and certainly in the 80s, what management is doing, and certainly in many, hospitals to manufacturing, they aren't talking about automation so much. They're talking about quality circles and participation, and what are the multi, et cetera, all of that. It's a kind of it's another ideological, effort to and then also in, of course, the non-union places, you can find this in Starbucks right now. A kind of Elton Mayo, he was an ideologue of managerial kind of stroking of workers. So what do you think is the relationship between the demise of automation and the rise of, what are your thoughts on that? Then we'll go to the Q&A, I guess.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I mean, because to a certain extent, like where automation sort of keeps itself alive, where it stays, is in the supposed like information revolution, right? When it comes to computers and the computerization, mainly of offices, but also, this like Daniel Bell stuff, post-industrial society, that the ability to manipulate information is going to be more important than manipulate actual physical things. But I actually, from what I see, especially coming in the late 80s and 90s, I mean, and maybe this is my hypothesis, I'd be curious what you think, but that this is coming out of the incredible ferment of the 1970s of workers, and not just of left movements within the labor movement, but also EEOA issues, when you have opening up the workplace to women and to Black Americans, and that now the office, can't, the workplace needs to somehow take on a friendlier face. It has to be seen to be accepting and quality, because you'll literally get sued if you don't do that. And so you have to find some ways to create an affect, at least, of acceptance, which is one of the ways you kind of forestall labor unions. Because, one of the few, I would say, I mean, especially as the NLRA is being challenged again and again, beginning in the 1970s, one of the few robust labor protections that exist. It comes in the form of the Civil Rights Movement, or the Civil Rights Act, I should say. I also think it has something to do with how management begins to see itself. And that's a slightly different question, like an ideological change, which is that management's now going to be, this is, just-in-time manufacturing, but it's also going to be, it's lean, it's savvy. We're not using the old methods of forcing human bodies to produce things. Rather, we're going to be at some higher psychological level where we're going to be manipulating people this way. And I think that's definitely a movement that's coming out of business schools more generally. Sure.
Yeah, I've always thought that and also in terms of the anti-union, simply just keeping unions out of the workforce, the automation discourse doesn't have much to do there, but the so-called human resources, kind of, which comes out of the work of Elton Mayo from the Westinghouse, not Westinghouse, the Western Electric experiments of the late 20s. I told my class, I said, if there's a bad guy, it's not Frederick Taylor, it's Elton Mayo. He's the real bad guy. Clark Kerr, by the way, called him a fascist. In an essay of the 50s. Anyway, but I mean, and that actually is the dominant. And that, you read any anti-union, boilerplate, and it, from Amazon to Starbucks, and it's all this sort of we're one big happy family, and etc. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. So maybe you can answer. I think what they want us to go on to Q&A now, but you'll have the chance to, I'm sure, to answer some. We talk more about artificial intelligence or whatnot. So do you want to open the Q&A? Are we ready to do that now? Hello.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation. So we're getting a couple of questions coming in. The first is from Debbie Goldman. Good. They ask, how does the introduction of digital technology beginning in the 1980s, with its enormous capacity to speed up and surveil the workforce, complicate your argument? I am thinking particularly of the telecommunications industry, where employers took advantage of the introduction of digital technologies to this effect, which at the same time generated an upsurge of resistance among the primarily female operators and customer service representatives. They definitely saw the workplace as an arena of political struggle.
Yeah, I mean, it's also great to see, Debbie. I mean, that's a fascinating question. I think, and I'd be curious, to hear what others have to say about this as well. I suppose, I mean, what in the 1980s, the introduction of digital technology in particular, it seems that it does like a few things besides actually increasing speed and increasing surveillance possibilities for capital, for employers. At the same time, at least what I see people talking about the most in the 80s is also the ability to break up the workplace. And this is going to sound a little Foucauldian perhaps, but one of the things that what automation actually is literally making it so workers cannot see each other effectively, that one part of the labor process can be turned against the other. And so something that this work isn't happening, or is, there's this amazing new mechanism that's actually doing the work, or is said to be doing the work. What it actually is another version of job degradation, where a single job is being broken up, but because of digital technologies, rather than being broken up on an assembly line, the detailed division of labor has an increasingly sort of like global quality to it. So I think there's no doubt. I mean, also, but to the point, like, the workers themselves absolutely knew, that this was an exploitative measure. I hope it doesn't seem like I'm arguing that workers didn't know throughout the post-war period that they didn't realize that they were being exploited. They absolutely did. I think one of the qualities of the automation discourses that had two effects was that on the one hand, you'd have individuals who would say something like, I'm working much harder now than I was before, but I know automation's going on over there on the other side of the plant or in another factory. Yeah. And, and they wouldn't necessarily credit their own experience as being typical or something. I mean, that's one quality. And then I think the other is, in fact, people would just know that automation's BS to a certain extent, that people are still doing it, but it wouldn't have any narrative power, right? You wouldn't be taken up. It wasn't seen as something that was like an actual historical narrative. It was a counter narrative that wasn't taken seriously. And so sometimes even union leaders would discount it when people are telling them this, especially if the workers weren't the kind of workers they like to think of as like the true workers. So, I mean, I think with like the telecommunications industry, how long it took for, I mean, especially like women clerical workers, which is not the same as telecommunication workers exactly by any means, but for, how long it took for union leaders to take this group of workers seriously as unionized workers as part of the labor movement. How the women's movement needed to break into a certain extent to the labor movement. These are workers who are doing real work. I think that's another quality of it. So workers, this can be going on, but it doesn't register in a kind of a national political way. And so that the labor movement itself at the level of leadership often, wouldn't necessarily take it seriously. That's sort of complicated.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Go on, Heather. You want to add any other questions?
Yeah. So the next one is from Amy Lozelle, and they ask, "Thank you so much for this excellent discussion of the cultural and social, as well as material issues associated with automation. I know you're currently doing work with more analysis of race, labor, and automation, and I am interested in gender and automation. This intersection most clearly plays out with robots, which are often gendered, especially in service fields in Japan. But what is the role of gender and automation in degrading traditionally masculine work, or with pulling women into manufacturing that had been dominated by male workers?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And it actually has a tendency even throughout the post-war period. And there are so many ways to answer this. But I mean, one of them often is I don't know, I wrote an article recently about the QWERTY keyboard, and it actually plays sort of to this exact point. So I'll just do a quick rehash, if you don't mind, because it's just along these lines. If you look at something like, typing as a task, throughout most of the 20th century, typing was understood to be a clerical work. Often was a feminized task, and no self-respecting man in an office, and certainly not a male manager, would actuate an alphanumeric keyboard himself, right? That would challenge his masculinity. It's hard to imagine this being so threatening to masculinity, but indeed it was. But then when it becomes clear that in order to continue to degrade office work, that typing would need to be expanded to both men and women. There you have actually the opposite. Rather, you have a female job being regendered as a neuter job in order to convince men that it was safe to type. And this was called automation, which is insane. It's crazy. More people are typing in the American office than ever before. And it said like, oh yeah, the computer is doing it. And so oftentimes this is the quality that you can definitely witness this move, which is to say that it's extremely fluid, but it's not just unidirectional. I mean, the other quality of this, which to be a little bit more like philosophical, perhaps, as I'm speed talking at you folks, it's to say that often when the task is made to be especially biological, it's also often feminized, right? I mean, this is standard of work in general, industrialized labor, but definitely with automation as well. When the kind of work is considered no longer fit for a full human being to do it, usually it gets a feminine cast, or it's coded as feminine in some way. And so this is definitely the case with something like service work, right? Like no human being should have to wash their own dishes. It's like this is this argument, so let's get a feminine robot to do it. And that's why, in fact, so many of the post-war robots, I'm talking about fictional robots, like robots that are women, it's because like, oh, this is a subhuman task. And so they'll get, Rosie the robot to do it or something. And even when they're male, something Robbie the robot's often called a housewife, even though he has a male voice. This is a fictional robot I'm talking about. And so I think that's the other quality that it has to it. When it's going to be understood to be something that no free person can do, it's usually something that's necessarily understood to be something that's somehow biologically feminine, or female, I should say. That was a convoluted answer, but that's my best shot.
All right, so our next one comes from Paul Fazio, and they ask, Professor Lichtenstein and Resnikoff, it seems the New Deal was made possible by an unprecedented crisis in capital, a sympathetic administration to labor, and mass organization and militancy on the part of the working class. Do you think that organizing model is still relevant today? Can you see America returning into a more social democratic direction under current circumstances? And if not, do you see any viable paths for increasing the power of American labor?
You want to take a shot at that, Nelson?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, gosh, yeah, there have been sort of multiple roadblocks to that have been sort of erected. That's one of the problems. Even when we clearly have today, the sentiment, pro-union sentiment is very high, historically very, very high. I've been actually very, I would say, let me put it this way, and maybe this links to the automation. As an old Marxist, very old-fashioned Marxist, primitive Marxist, I thought, well, the relationship of a worker's means to production, that's the key to consciousness, So auto work is, et cetera, but in fact, when we look right now at which strata of the working class is in motion, from Starbucks workers to teaching assistants to museum curators to people, young journalists. This is a cultural strata, right? A kind of underpaid, overeducated kind of a strata, and that's in motion, and that's terrific. And I don't think it's the relationship to the means of production that's radicalizing them. It's broader cultural, racial, gendered issues, and whatever is motivating them, I'm all for it. So we do have that. But I would say this, that, and this gets to some of the ideological nature of management. The biggest obstacle to this rise of a new union movement today is not the rotten nature of the labor law. You could make the labor law perfect tomorrow, and this would still, what it is, it's the mindset of management, which for 50 years now has been increasingly sort of intransigent and authoritarian, whatever its a cultural kind of camouflage it puts itself in. And, we see that at Starbucks right now, which is just remarkable, because here's a company that has tried to create a kind of certain kind of liberal culture about it. But when it comes to unionization, it's just as tough as any Walmart or any Amazon or any rotten employer. So, but I think maybe if that would we could figure out some way that could change. That is the mindset of capital. Although I haven't figured that out yet. But I do think that. But no, I think it's something very hopeful is happening in that respect, in that one aspect of American workplace. So, Jason.
No, I think it's well said. I mean, I wonder, and I don't know how popular an idea this would be, but I do sometimes find it kind of frustrating that, I mean, if the difference between the New Deal and now is, if you look at something like the Flint sit-down strike, there you had actually a part of the political class that allied itself. I mean, one of the things I find remarkable about at least the Democratic Party at present, not the whole thing, but a large tranche of it, is that it's just like leaving political capital lying in the street, which it could be allying itself. I mean, sort of as the New Deal actually did, even as, they might distance themselves from the true left wing of the labor movement, they also brought a lot of it in. And it seems to me that that does have a kind of usefulness. And in fact, they're really not, I think that to a certain extent, at least the Democratic Party tends to kind of demobilize more than it does, and I find, and there might be like kind of, if the New Deal is going to be our analogy, that you need a kind of, you do need some high political actors who are actually willing to ride the wave. And that's been,
I mean, Biden has made these pro-union statements, but meanwhile, a whole cohort of Obama high political are now working for Uber and places like that. And frankly, they use this technological utopianism as part of their rationale for what they're doing. And that Uber does that all the time, and that's a kind of a refuge of their ideological refuge of what they're doing. Yeah,
learn to code, right? That's what you need to say yourself.
Go ahead. Next question. Yeah, go ahead. One more.
Yeah, so this is kind of in a similar vein. So the next question is from Jack Doherty, and they ask, in the context of Marx, does automation potentiate the alienation of the proletariat to the means of production, and that they are further removed from production? Or does automation decrease exploitation and that it decreases the quantity of exploitative labor and perhaps indirectly leads to a more passion-oriented economy?
I mean, I wonder what you say about this, Nelson, but I think if automation was what it said it was, if it actually was reducing the amount of human labor, there'd be some potential for that. But I think the basic argument of my book is what we call automation is an ideological gloss on many different kinds, a constellation of changes to the means of production. And that some of these speed up labor, some of them create more jobs. Sometimes indeed a mechanism might actually replace some aspect of the labor process that used to be animated by a human being. But that there's this, what needs to be contested is this sense that there's a telos to history. Maybe that's in terms of Marx, that we're heading for is like perfect alienation from the means of production, perfect automation, perfect automaticity, maybe it might be better. But in fact, I think the story of industrial production has been that it's incredibly dynamic and it's constantly changing, and that to make money is not to be a technological determinist. And so it's like, could it be a more passion-oriented economy? I think the real question is, what do we want the economy to look like? I mean, this is a question that's totally beyond democratic politics at present. I mean, which is to say we can maybe have an industrial policy where we decide what a good job is. But at present, rather, what's happening is that you see capital at the same time that it degrades labor, it also exploits it, it exploits it all the more readily. And so you'll use a machine next to a human being, and they might even do the same job, and I think, look, the climate crisis gives us kind of an eye into how, I think capital often thinks about power or energy, which is that it will use anything at its disposal. And so the idea that capital will just give up on human labor doesn't make any sense, especially if it can cheapen it. And we'll use a machine one day and a person the next, and then a machine again. And so this is the story of automation, that somehow this dynamics, non-teleological story is nevertheless seems persuasive. It's like somehow tomorrow all the jobs will be gone. I don't know, that's kind of a non-answer.
There are other schemas for reduction of human labor outside of the automation discourse. So in the 30s, Keynes made the prediction, I think he wrote in the early 30s, that in a century, i.e. around the year 2030, the work week would be 15 hours, a week. And I mean, his argument was that, well, Keynesian argument that, you could create a more, using governmental tools of fiscal, you could construct an economy in which productivity goes up. He wasn't thinking in automation, obviously, but productivity just goes up. It had been going up all during the 19th century, and that that the working class would get the fruits of that, and they get the fruits of it in terms of leisure, of more time off work. And of course, when he was writing in the early 30s, this was just at the end of the moment when, in fact, the work week had declined, in real terms throughout the 19th century. So there are other outside the automation discourse, which could lead to a reduction in working time. Part of the problem today is that when those experiments have happened, given the squeeze on wages and incomes, and although I don't buy into this consumption ethic, like we're all Americans have been seduced by consumption, but nevertheless, people do start taking two jobs rather than one when one of their jobs is less. But I think there are ways to think about reduction in work time, which are progressive, I think, and not part of this automation discourse.
Indeed. And I would even add the idea of what is the work of society, not to get too grandiose here, but it's just like, what do tasks actually need to be fulfilled? And then to decide how should we divide them so that it's, somehow consistent with human autonomy. But, there's a lot of work that the society does that I think it doesn't really need to do at all. And look, this is a popular thing to say, but it's true. At the very beginning of the pandemic, as scary as it was, things slowed down a little bit. And I remember thinking, like, this feels right. Why don't we just slow down? In fact, the planet's demanding it. And that question of, like, why can't we actually just decide to do that? We could, and that's another way we could talk about work diminution. We should just do less of it.
Yeah. Heather?
So it looks like we've got time for about one more question, and there's several others here, but Jason, I will send you these after the event and you can feel free to reach out to people. So the next one is from Salem Elsway, and they ask, one set of the actors you left out of the book were the engineers and scientists who actually developed the technologies that fell under the umbrella of automation. Was there a strategic reason for not including them, and how would their intellectual and political interpretations and positions about their creations have impacted your arguments and the book?
Yeah, it was a deliberate choice. And I think mainly because the focus of the discussion was about the meaning of work, right? To try to reorient the discussion away from the actual technical means, because usually histories of automation do exactly that. So-called automation, they'll like focus on a few particular devices and show how the device was made. And it ends up being not fetishized exactly, but we lose what the machine is actually doing, which is it's mediating relations between, in my estimation, mainly between employers and employees. And so, like, that was the thing I wanted to focus on more. I mean, there was like a few versions of this when it was going deep into information theory and the cybernetics movement. And then, of course, on the industrial robots, who's building the actual robots. And I think if we were to bring that into the case, I think what it might show, and it is, of course, very interesting, is how speculative some of this is, how, contingent the development of these means, in fact, are, and how capital sometimes uses them and sometimes doesn't. This is definitely true with, for example, computing technology. That's probably the place where it was the biggest internal fight for me. Like, am I really going to get into Project Whirlwind and Jay Forrester and these people who are developing these computer systems? Well, first of all, their histories have been written already, so I wouldn't necessarily trespass on that. But secondly, it just didn't actually seem terribly important to do that, because the actual mechanism is not the thing that mattered to me, even though it had to be developed for capital to use it. Rather, it was the ideas that capital had in order to deploy it, and that what would convince an employer to buy it and then try to bring it into their workforce. And I think that's why I tried to actually, strange it is in a book about automation, try to decenter machines as much as possible. And unfortunately, that might have also meant that engineers so there might be a story there that's worth telling, but at least for the purposes of this book, I thought it better to shy away. That'd be my answer.
All right. Well, it looks like we're about out of time. Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. A reminder to everyone that this event has been recorded and it should be up by tomorrow. You'll receive an email from Zoom that'll have a link, but you can also just keep an eye on the University of Illinois Press social media accounts. We'll announce it when it's ready. You can use promo code LE40 to get a 40% off discount on the book on our website. So feel free to pick up a copy there. And Dr. Lichtenstein and Dr. Resnikoff, do you have any final words for us?
A lot of fun. I urge people to buy the book. It's there's a lot in there it's unexpected. It's great, terrific.
And thank you all for coming in. Thank you, Heather, for putting this together, and thank you, Nelson, for your excellent questions. It's really a privilege to talk with you folks. So thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.